Imagine waking up in a primitive matriarchal society where men are seen as useless mouths to feed. Our protagonist, Leo, was just kicked out of the tribe by the chiefess because he couldn't bear children. She claimed men are only good for picking berries, the lowest of tasks. But everything changed the moment he used a vine trap to pull a catch from the river. When he hauled up the fattest fish they had ever seen, every woman's expression shifted instantly. While they were still fighting over a few sour green berries, he was already feeding the men succulent roasted fish. This was all possible because he possessed something they could never understand: 5,000 years of human civilization and wisdom. At this moment, inside the damp cave, we see a clear divide. On one side are the female tribeswomen following Chiefess Maya, wearing high-quality leather skirts. On the other side stand the men behind Leo, clad only in hemp ropes or single leaves, if they aren't completely bare. These men tremble under Maya's cold gaze, looking as though they are on the verge of tears. She snaps at them, telling Leo and the others that they fail at every hunt and are utterly useless. She mocks them for being unable to weave or bear children and reminds them that they are forbidden from cultivation. Yet, she notes with irritation that one or two of them persist in practicing those useless arts every single day, wasting the tribe's time. To her, if they cannot even provide food, they have no purpose at all. Maya's voice is ice cold as she orders them to get out, while the surrounding women watch with utter disdain. Deep down, Leo realized the absurdity of his situation as he processed his new reality. He had been transported back to a primitive era where women held all the power. In this world, women are the supreme rulers because they bring forth life, weave skins into clothing, and raise the children. They are seen as divine beings, while the men are viewed as little more than slightly stronger monkeys. Leo clenched his fists tightly, knowing full well the flaws of this matriarchal setup. Their technology is non-existent, their weapons are primitive, and they live on the brink of starvation, constantly chewing on tree bark and berries. To be honest, a meal of cooked meat was an impossible dream for them. If there was one upside to this society, it was that the women were remarkably beautiful with fair skin and striking features. Suddenly, a mechanical voice echoed in his head, congratulating him on awakening the patriarchal construction system. His new mission: to build a powerful male-led society. The system introduced a contribution shop where he could unlock achievements by fixing the flaws of this society. By doing things that benefited the growth of a patriarchal tribe, he would earn points to exchange for resources. These points could buy anything he could imagine, serving as the foundation for his new empire. As the electronic voice faded, a slight smirk played on Leo's lips. His cheat code had finally arrived, even if staying in this particular tribe was no longer an option. In this world, cultivation is possible, which is why the women are so physically vibrant and beautiful. Chiefess Maya alone could easily overpower a dozen men. As for why the men were so weak, well, the reason was quite simple and rather unfortunate. Current cultivation methods are designed strictly for the female anatomy. Men who try them face a high risk of internal collapse, and even then, they are far less efficient. But with his system active, Leo decided it was time to show these women what a real man could do. A young woman named Mia stepped forward, pleading with the chiefess to show mercy since the heat was unbearable and the berries were gone. She begged her not to exile Leo until the weather cooled. Just as Leo was about to fire back at Maya himself, the other women began to jeer. They insisted that men deserved punishment and that there was no room for negotiation. Maya glared at Mia with eyes like ice, ordering her to step back. Leo felt a flicker of warmth in his heart. Mia was a younger sister figure who had grown up with him. Unlike the others who treated him like an animal, she truly respected him as an older brother. As Mia opened her mouth to plead again, Leo cut her off, telling Maya that if she wanted him gone, she shouldn't take it out on a young girl. He declared that he would take the men and leave the tribe immediately. He looked Maya in the eye and made a bold promise. He vowed to lead the men to build a new tribe that would thrive 1,000 times better than any matriarchy. He told her that one day, he would wait for her to come crawling back in tears. His voice rang out with a confidence that stunned the cave into silence. Maya suddenly burst into laughter, her slender frame shaking with genuine amusement at what she considered a ridiculous joke. She looked at him with chilling mockery, calling him a stinking male monkey for daring to speak to a chiefess that way, while the other women joined in the ridicule. The women burst into mocking laughter, jeering that a male monkey who can't weave, build, or even raise a child would dare claim he could build a better tribe. To be honest, not a single soul believed him. Behind him, the other men, gaunt and skeletal, sighed in despair, begging Leo to kneel and beg for mercy. They knew that leaving the tribe right now was essentially a death sentence. Leo ignored their pleas, knowing they had been conditioned to accept abuse as their only reality. He waved a hand, telling them that if they followed him, he would lead them to a life of plenty. Most of the men remained deaf to his words, choosing to grovel before Chiefess Maya like frightened animals just to stay. Only 3 men, tired of the constant humiliation, stepped forward to join him. 2 older tribesmen and a young man his own age stood by Leo's side, preferring to freeze in the wild than remain slaves. They weren't following his vision so much as they were revolting against Maya's cruelty. The men who stayed behind watched them leave with pity, certain they were walking toward their doom. Without a second glance, Leo led his small group out of the cave and into the unknown. A little later, footsteps echoed behind them, and they turned to see Mia running toward them with tear-filled eyes. She reached out and pressed a few sour green berries into Leo's hand. Looking at those few berries, Leo felt a surge of emotion. In this society, these were precious rations she must have secretly saved for him. He gently patted her head and gave her a confident smile. He promised her he would return, and though Mia looked ready to burst into tears, she chose to believe in him. She wiped her eyes, whispered a final goodbye, and turned back toward the cave. Watching her retreat, Leo vowed not to let her down. But as he turned his gaze toward the horizon, he was absolutely stunned by what he saw. While the tribe feared starvation, the wilderness before him was a literal gold mine of resources. We see herds of fat antelope, massive beehives dripping with honey, and trees heavy with giant fruit. His companions, however, saw only death, wondering aloud if they should beg another tribe for scraps. They were tired of being called monkeys, yet they couldn't imagine a world where men weren't slaves. While the three men wallowed in despair, Leo was already a whirlwind of activity. He spent the next few hours climbing trees for vines and digging through the mud, completely tireless despite the filth. He eventually made his way down to the riverbank, focused on a very specific goal. The fish here were massive and prized. A single catch was worth 3 men in trade between tribes. Leo set to work weaving a vine net, determined to solve their hunger crisis in one go. One of the men, a strong youth named Marcus, approached him with a look of pure confusion. He was lean and soot-covered like the others, but his eyes still held a spark of spirit. Leo didn't look up, simply asking Marcus to help him catch the fish for their dinner. Marcus stared in utter disbelief as Leo continued to meticulously knot the vines into a sturdy mesh. Marcus told him he was truly insane, explaining that the others had already written him off as a madman. He reminded Leo that these fish were lightning fast and far too slippery to ever be caught by hand. He spoke from experience, having once spent an entire day exhausting himself just to chase a single shadow in the water. But Leo just smiled, knowing that with the right tools, the impossible was about to become very simple indeed. Marcus spent the entire afternoon buzzing in Leo's ear like a persistent fly, doubting every move. Leo finally wiped the sweat from his brow and told him plainly, either help out or move aside. To Marcus, fish were legendary delicacies that even a chiefess might never taste. He looked at Leo's serious expression and hesitated, remembering that Leo had never actually lied to him before. Deciding to risk it, Marcus sat down with a heavy sigh, claiming he was only helping because they were friends, not because he believed in this fishing nonsense. Leo didn't argue, simply handing him one end of the vines. As the sky turned a dusty yellow, time was running out. With Marcus's help, the weaving speed doubled, though the other men nearby watched with pity, convinced Leo had finally lost his mind. They mocked the gaps in the mesh, certain it was a waste of effort. Little did they know, Leo's focus was sharpening. As the sun dipped lower, he let out a triumphant shout of success. Before them lay a massive square net, weighted with stones and rigged with a central vine to pull it shut. Leo tested the tension of the mesh with a satisfied nod. It was sturdy enough to last dozens of trips, but Marcus just stared at it blankly. To him, this complicated invention looked like nothing more than a very poorly made grass sleeping mat. Leo just told him to wait and see. He gathered the net into his arms, walked to the river's edge, and with a powerful heave, watched it bloom across the water before sinking into the depths. Marcus nearly had a heart attack, screaming that Leo had just thrown hours of hard work into the river. He pointed a trembling finger at the water, his face turning a deep shade of red from sheer frustration. He ranted that Leo was truly a madman and that he regretted helping at all. Watching the bubbles rise from the sunken net, Marcus looked utterly defeated, mourning what he thought was a perfectly good sleeping mat. Leo ignored the nagging and told him to shut up and grab the vine. He began to pull with everything he had, his muscles straining against the weight of the river. The vine cut into their hands as they struggled against the current. Marcus looked ready to shove Leo into the river out of spite, but together, they finally dragged the heavy mass onto the bank. Leo stepped forward to inspect the haul, hoping the stones had done their job. He knelt before the wet bundle and took a deep breath, knowing this moment would decide their future. As he peeled back the vines, a massive, slippery fish flopped out and smacked him right in the face. He fell back, wiping river slime from his eyes, only to see 4 large fish and 8 smaller ones thrashing on the grass. They were fat, healthy, and more food than these men had seen in weeks. A familiar chime echoed in his mind, congratulating him on his first major contribution to the tribe's survival. He brushed the mud off his clothes, feeling the weight of the reward points settling in. It was a perfect start. Behind him, Marcus stood frozen, staring at the silver scales glistening in the light as if he were seeing a ghost. He stammered, asking what on earth these were. Leo calmly explained they were fish, but Marcus's brain seemed to have short-circuited. He scratched his head, wondering how creatures from the water had suddenly appeared on dry land. Leo pointed to the net, explaining it was a tool for catching them, but Marcus was still calling it a magic grass mat. It was clear that some concepts were just too new for him to grasp, but the sight of the fish was undeniable proof that life was about to change. We return to the riverbank, where the first successful haul has just been brought ashore. Marcus's eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and dawning hunger. Nearby, a few other tribesmen with keen eyesight squinted through the twilight toward the water, noticing Marcus and Leo huddled over something unusual. One of them whispered the word fish, causing his companion to swallow hard. After all, these men were given far less food than the women and had spent the day exhausted from gathering berries. The mere thought of fish made their mouths water, though they quickly dismissed it as a joke, knowing such delicacies were rare even for chieftains, let alone for men like them. One man scoffed, asking how Leo could possibly catch anything, and noted that even if it were food, it wouldn't be right to eat it since they hadn't helped with the work. They sighed, resigning themselves to a dinner of dry twigs and grass, until a figure emerged from the shadows carrying something heavy. As the figure drew closer, they realized it was Marcus, triumphantly holding a string of vines with several large, thrashing fish dangling from each side. Marcus approached the group with a sly grin, telling Silas and Caleb that if they wanted a bite of this fish, they would have to follow Leo's lead from now on. He explained that Leo intended to build a tribe far stronger than their old one, and to join him, they would have to acknowledge him as their new leader. Silas and Caleb stared at the glistening, flopping fish with their mouths hanging open, their stomachs growling so loudly it was almost a conversation of its own. Silas was in complete disbelief, but Marcus just laughed, reminding them that a single small fish was usually worth the labor of 3 men, and these were massive. Marcus held the fish up, letting them catch the light, and reiterated the condition. To eat, they must accept Leo as their chieftain. Caleb fought his hunger, suspiciously claiming he didn't believe Leo caught them himself and demanding proof that the fish weren't poisoned or scavenged. Silas snapped out of his trance, his survival instincts kicking in. The idea of catching fish was so foreign that it felt like a dangerous trap. Marcus scratched his head, thinking they were being unnecessarily difficult, and decided to take them back to Leo to see the process for themselves. He led the 2 skeptics back to the river, where Leo was already casting the net into the water for a second time. We see Leo haul the heavy mesh back in, revealing another bounty of 3 large fish and 6 smaller ones, earning him even more recognition from the system. Silas and Caleb stood frozen, witnessing the impossible act of pulling life directly from the river with a simple weave of grass. In that moment, all their doubts vanished, replaced by a desperate urge to pledge their loyalty to the man who could provide such a feast. Leo turned his head calmly and asked Marcus if the others had agreed. He had sent Marcus with fish to win over Silas and Caleb, but the 2 men now stood there with looks of pure disgust. Marcus scratched his head, explaining that they didn't want the fish because they were convinced the creatures were poisonous. Leo let out a cry of disbelief. To him, a fish was just a fish. He wondered why these starving men were being so difficult when he had just pulled the fresh catch from the river. He told them that if they didn't want the fish, they could go back to eating berries. The 2 men immediately changed their tune, smiling and insisting that Leo was their new leader. They apologized for ever thinking he was crazy and promised to follow his every command from now on. Silas and Caleb nodded eagerly, their previous caution completely forgotten. After all, Leo was the man who could actually produce food, and in this world, that made him a god among men. A single fish was worth more than the labor of 3 men, so they decided that dignity was a small price to pay for a full stomach. Marcus watched them, realizing that with enough fish, one truly could rule the world. Leo chuckled at their sudden loyalty and decided to give them 2 smaller fish for their dinner instead of the large ones. The 2 men looked at the massive fish Leo kept, and then at their own palm-sized portions. They sighed inwardly but didn't dare complain, knowing that even a small fish was better than the days they spent starving. Since they hadn't helped with the work, they knew they should be grateful for any scrap at all. Leo thought the meat would taste much better if it were grilled over a fire. But just as he had the thought, Marcus and the others were already preparing to tear into the raw fish with their teeth. Leo quickly stopped them, telling them they should cook the fish first. The air seemed to freeze at his words, and the faces of his 3 companions were suddenly filled with absolute terror. Silas trembled, exchanging worried glances with the others as they swallowed hard. They began to regret saying Leo wasn't crazy, because to them, fire was a terrifying force sent by the gods. They remembered how divine fire would descend from the heavens and consume entire tribes. Every tribe viewed fire as a great taboo to be avoided at all costs, yet here was Leo, claiming he would summon it. The trio looked at Leo with a new kind of fear, and suddenly, even the delicious fish in their hands didn't seem so appetizing. Leo felt uncomfortable under their gaze, thinking that starting a fire shouldn't be such a big deal. He looked around for materials, but found the idea of rubbing sticks together far too tedious. Suddenly, the system detected his thoughts and offered him a solution, a windproof lighter for 20 points. The system explained that this device could produce a flame even in strong winds. Leo slapped his leg in excitement, having almost forgotten that his system could be so incredibly helpful and intuitive. He mentally agreed to the exchange, and a small, black, rectangular box appeared in his hand. It felt as hard as a stone, and he realized it could even double as a handy tool for blunt force if needed. Marcus pleaded with Leo to stop, warning him that summoning fire was an insult to the gods that would bring disaster. He begged Leo to just eat the fish raw before they lost their freshness. He warned that wasting such a gift would make their ancestors angry, but they didn't want to start eating until their leader did. Silas and Caleb joined in, urging Leo not to waste any more time on this madness. Leo just grinned, telling them they would regret eating raw fish once they smelled the aroma of grilled meat. He couldn't stand the fishy smell of raw flesh and was determined to have a proper feast. Seeing his resolve, the three tribesmen gave up and began devouring their raw fish with desperate hunger. They marveled at the taste, wondering how they had ever survived on nothing but grass and berries for so long. The tribesmen left nothing but bones, and if those bones weren't so sharp, they likely would have swallowed the fish whole. Meanwhile, Leo gathered dry branches nearby to prepare a fire. Marcus whispered to the others, wondering if their leader was truly serious about summoning the divine fire. He couldn't believe Leo would skip dinner just for the sake of a myth. Leo ignored their whispers, focused on his task. He used stones to create a small circle on the ground, carefully layering the base with dry grass and bark. Once the wood was stacked, he clicked his windproof lighter. A tiny flame flickered to life in the darkness, and the system chimed, rewarding him 20 points for achieving Fire God's gift. He had already gutted the fish by the river and skewered them on sticks. As he brought the lighter to the kindling, Marcus woke from a light nap, rubbing his eyes as he headed for the bushes. Suddenly, Marcus froze, his eyes widening in pure terror. In the pitch-black night, the orange glow illuminated Leo's face, revealing the one thing every primitive soul feared, the divine fire. Marcus let out a blood-curdling scream and collapsed to the ground. His cries jolted Silas and Caleb awake, and as they saw the dancing flames, their faces twisted into masks of absolute horror. They cried out that Leo had brought a curse upon them and was going to kill them all. Every terrifying legend about fire flooded their minds, making them howl like trapped animals facing execution. Leo looked at the three of them, annoyed by the racket in the middle of the night. They wailed that the entire coast would be turned into a sea of flames and that everyone was doomed. They scrambled away in a panic, nearly tripping over themselves. Leo looked down at the tiny flame in his hand, wondering why they were making such a fuss over a pocket lighter. He clicked the lighter off, telling them the divine fire was gone, but they wouldn't listen. Marcus shouted that fire always spreads until everyone is consumed by the curse of the gods. Silas sobbed into his hands, refusing to believe the danger had passed, while Caleb and Marcus struggled to even breathe. Leo sighed and told them to just turn around and look. Marcus slowly peeked through his fingers, expecting a wall of heat and death. Instead, he saw only darkness. There was no inferno, no screaming, and certainly no sea of flames. He muttered in disbelief that the fire was truly gone. Caleb and Marcus turned around trembling, finding only the silent, black night instead of the hellscape they had imagined. They collapsed in relief, feeling as though they had just cheated death. But then, Leo clicked the lighter again, and the small flame reappeared right before their eyes. Their hearts jumped into their throats as their legs turned to jelly. They wanted to run, but their bodies wouldn't move. They were caught between the urge to flee and the desire to simply give up. Leo stood over them, clicking the lighter on and off with a calm expression. He told them that the fire they feared was something he could easily control, leaving Marcus staring in a daze. Marcus stammered that only the gods could command such a force. Caleb shook his head in denial, insisting that what they were seeing defied every law of nature they knew. Silas couldn't take his eyes off the flame, wondering if their previous reverence for fire had all been for nothing. While they were paralyzed by shock, Leo finally lit the actual campfire. The flames grew, and Leo began roasting the fish. He watched the fat sizzle with excitement, thinking that after a long time of eating sour berries, he was finally going to have a real meal. Our protagonist had been surviving on wild greens for so long that his cheeks were starting to hollow out. After a long day of work without a single bite, the prospect of grilled fish was almost overwhelming, though he did find the dish a bit plain until he squeezed some of the berries Sophie had given him over the top. He took a bite, finding the skin perfectly charred and the meat tender, with the tartness of the berries adding a wonderful layer of flavor. As he ate with gusto, the three tribesmen watched in a daze, wondering why their leader was using the sacred divine fire just to cook a fish. The aroma wafting through the air was unlike anything Marcus or Silas had ever smelled, and their eyes remained fixed on the meal. Marcus finally gathered his courage and asked, with a trembling voice, exactly what it was that Leo was eating. The scent was so intoxicating that it had managed to override his primal fear of the flames. Leo simply chewed his food and reminded them that this was the very meal he told them they would regret missing out on. Silas pointed a shaking finger at the grilled fish, asking if Leo had truly summoned the divine fire just to make his dinner taste better. Leo gave a simple nod, leaving the three of them utterly speechless at the sheer audacity of using a godlike power for culinary improvement. In that moment, they looked at him with a mixture of awe and genuine terror, seeing a man whose will seemed to surpass the heavens themselves. There were no sharp scales, no slimy residue, and no foul-smelling organs, only tender meat that smelled far better than anything raw. Caleb was practically drooling by now, completely lost in the scent of the roasting fish. Leo picked a bone from his mouth and noted that since they hadn't believed him earlier, he couldn't really be blamed for their hunger, a statement that hit them like a bolt of lightning. They had already resolved to never doubt him again, yet they couldn't help but mourn the fact that they had been so stubborn in the first place, with Caleb looking particularly ready to burst into tears. Leo glanced at the 3 large fish he had prepared and decided to pull one off the skewer, handing it over to Marcus and Silas. He told them to share it, noting that he had plans for the final fish and reminding them that if they ate his food, they were expected to work hard. The 2 men hesitated for a moment, caught between their hunger and the fear that eating something touched by the divine fire might be a sacrilege. But before they could decide, Caleb stepped forward with a dismissive laugh, claiming he was more than happy to take their share. While the other 2 were still wavering, Caleb snatched the fish and began devouring it with reckless abandon. He mocked them for being too afraid to eat something that smelled this good, telling them they were far too slow to keep up with the heat of the moment. Marcus and Silas panicked when they saw Caleb inhaling more than half the fish and immediately forgot all about divine punishment. They scrambled to grab whatever was left from Caleb's mouth, but to be honest, they were a bit too late for the best parts. With only a small portion of the tail remaining, the 2 of them split the scrap and wept over how much they had missed out on. They cursed Caleb for his greed, while Leo watched the chaotic scene with an amused, quiet smile. By the time the meal was finished, the night had grown deep, but the silence was suddenly broken by approaching footsteps. It was Sophie, calling out to Leo that she had brought him some of the tribe's best sour berries, worried that he hadn't eaten all day. The young woman looked exhausted as she sat down on a nearby rock, explaining that she had to sneak out because the chief had forbidden anyone from visiting them. She was certain Leo must be starving after his long ordeal. She opened her small hands to reveal a few plump, fresh berries, her eyes full of genuine concern for his well-being. Leo looked at her and smiled, touched by the gesture, though he had just finished an entire large fish and was perfectly full. He realized that food was scarce in the tribe and that she must have saved her own meager portion just to bring it to him. It was a kind gesture, if a bit unnecessary given his current state of satisfaction. He chuckled softly and pushed her hands back, telling her to eat them herself before they lost their freshness. Sophie grew frantic, reminding him that he had always been physically weak and that he wouldn't survive the night without nourishment. The 3 tribesmen nearby couldn't help but burst into laughter at her words, mocking the idea that a few berries were considered precious. They told her quite bluntly that they no longer had any interest in such meager, sour fruit. They boasted that if they didn't care for the berries, then their leader Leo certainly wouldn't either. Sophie snapped back in anger, telling them they were useless men who didn't understand that even the women in the tribe rarely got to eat fruit this good. The tribesmen mocked her, suggesting she was just trying to save face because she couldn't find anything better for Leo to eat. Silas and the others looked quite smug as they told Sophie that they didn't need her berries anymore, simply because they had fish. Sophie, naturally, was stunned. To her, fish were things that lived in the river, not on a plate. Even their powerful chief, Diana, would salivate at the mere mention of one. She couldn't wrap her head around how a few exiled men could possibly have caught something that even the strongest leaders in the region had never tasted. Leo simply smiled and reached into the warm wood ash, pulling out a perfectly preserved grilled fish that was still steaming. Sophie stared at the skewer in his hand, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and pure shock. He handed the fish to her with a casual air, as if offering a rare delicacy was just a routine part of his evening. She held it with trembling hands, unable to believe that the legendary creature she had only imagined was now right in front of her. She noted that it looked nothing like the slippery things in the river, as this one was golden, glistening with oil, and smelled divine. Leo explained that this was the magic of grilling and encouraged her to take a bite to see for herself. Trusting him completely, Sophie took a cautious nibble and was instantly transported to a new world of flavor. For someone who had lived on nothing but tart berries, the rich fat of the fish was a revelation, and she finished the whole thing in a matter of seconds. Her eyes sparkled with delight, though she suddenly felt a wave of embarrassment for bringing her meager berries to a man who was feasting like a king. Leo, sensing her shift in mood, changed the subject and asked how the other exiled men in the tribe were faring. Sophie explained that things were grim. Chief Diana had moved the men to a remote area to save on resources, leaving a dozen people to share food meant for only a few. They were forced to perform heavy labor on empty stomachs, making their situation increasingly desperate. Some had even died trying to force their cultivation without proper nourishment, leaving the survivors on the brink of starvation. Leo nodded slowly, realizing that while their suffering was great, it also meant the timing was perfect to recruit them to his cause. He told Sophie it was getting late and that she should take some fish back with her before heading home. He stood up to lead her to the riverbank where he had kept his catch alive and secured with branches, but Sophie just stood there, completely bewildered. She asked him if he truly meant to just give away something so incredibly valuable as if it were common grass. She insisted she couldn't take them, reminding him that fish were a luxury no one in the nearby tribes could afford, even if he had been lucky enough to find a few. She told him to hide the rest and protect himself, promising to return and check on him whenever she could. Leo remained silent for a moment, feeling a bit insulted that she thought he had simply stumbled upon the fish by accident, a misunderstanding he decided to correct immediately. He looked her in the eye and reiterated his plan to build a tribe 1,000 times stronger than Diana's. When she looked at him with skepticism, he told her to follow him, his voice carrying a weight of absolute seriousness that she couldn't ignore. Sophie followed, though deep down she feared the trauma of being exiled had finally caused Leo to lose his mind. The tribe was already whispering that he had gone mad, and hearing him speak of such impossible dreams only made her heart ache with pity. Leo could see the pity in her eyes and felt his blood pressure rising. He realized that words alone would never convince these people. Without another word, he took her hand and pulled her toward the water, ignoring the slight blush that crept onto her face. The moment he pulled back the netting at the river's edge, Sophie froze in utter disbelief. There, thrashing in the water, were dozens of fish, some large, some small, all caught in a way she had never seen before. She asked in a whisper if he had found all of these by luck, but Leo calmly explained that he had caught them using the net. He selected a few choice fish, strung them together with a sturdy vine, and handed them over to the speechless young woman. Her entire worldview was crumbling as she realized that the man everyone called weak was doing the impossible in the very waters they feared. She began to wonder if his boast about building a superior tribe wasn't just the talk of a madman, but a genuine promise. Leo told her to keep the fish for herself and warned her not to let anyone else see them, giving her a playful tap on the head. Sophie stood there clutching the heavy gift, her mind a whirlwind of happiness and lingering shock as she watched him walk away. She found herself staring at his back, her face turning a deep shade of red as she processed everything that had happened. Leo suddenly turned back with a mischievous glint in his eye, suggesting that if she was too tired to walk, she was more than welcome to stay the night. Sophie's face turned a deep shade of crimson as she looked away, her usual composure replaced by a sudden, shy fidgeting. Leo couldn't help but feel a sense of playful triumph. Even in a world where social norms were simpler, she was still just a young girl prone to blushing. Of course, he was only joking about her staying the night, even if he wanted her to. His shelter was currently just one large shared bed with no privacy whatsoever. Sophie kept her head down, her eyes fixed firmly on the tips of her toes as she struggled to find her voice. She stammered that she was still too young, suggesting they wait until she was as grown as Chief Diana. Leo fell into a thoughtful silence. While Sophie was already a renowned beauty, he wondered if waiting until she was like that formidable woman was strictly necessary. He pondered her words, sensing a deeper meaning behind the comparison to the chief, but before he could process it, Sophie had already hurried away in a fit of shyness. Left alone under the darkening sky, Leo felt a sudden, lingering sense of emptiness. He decided then and there that he needed his trio of followers to build him a proper house immediately. He simply couldn't wait any longer. With a sigh, he crawled back into the shared shelter to sleep, while elsewhere, in a damp cave to the southwest, a group of emaciated men sat in grim silence. The cave was dark, cold, and suffocatingly humid, a place where even breathing felt like a chore for the starving exiles. Suddenly, one of them, a man named Silas, began to convulse violently, his face twisting in agony. The others cried out in alarm, shaking him frantically as they feared he had lost control of his internal energy. Silas snapped his eyes open, his pupils bloodshot as he gasped for air, drenched in a cold sweat and trembling with the realization that he had nearly died. He recoiled in horror, knowing that if he hadn't regained his focus, he would have ended up like the others who perished during their training. It was a bitter truth that the men couldn't cultivate as quickly as the women, often struggling for months to achieve what the women did in a single day. The surrounding men scolded him with trembling voices, asking why he would risk his life when so many had already died trying. Silas let out a hollow laugh, asking if they should just wait for death instead, as staying here without power meant a slow and certain end. He looked at them with a bitter smile, being the eldest and most experienced among them. Even if his progress was slow, he felt a heavy responsibility to his brothers. If he couldn't break through and find food, he would be failing the men who looked up to him. Despite his grueling efforts, he was still stuck at the first stage of cultivation, gaining only a bit of extra strength and vitality. Meanwhile, almost all the women in the tribe had reached the second or third stage, possessing enough power to easily overpower any man with a single hand. Chief Diana had even reached the fourth stage, and even a young girl like Sophie was stronger than Silas. He clenched his fists in self-mockery, wondering why life had to be so difficult simply because they were born men, before telling the others it was time to start their daily gathering tasks. He dragged his exhausted, weakened body toward the cave entrance, followed by the others who whispered gloomily about how much longer they could survive. They shared a look of weary resignation, knowing there was no other way to live in this harsh reality. One of them joked that if a god were to walk toward them with food and offer them a life without hunger, he would gladly serve as a beast of burden. They all shared a tragic laugh, knowing such a miracle was impossible, until a voice called out from the entrance. A man appeared in the blinding sunlight, shouting that he had come to save them by order of the great and all-powerful Chief Leo. It was Marcus, grinning ear to ear and holding a fresh fish in each hand like a trophy. The group stood frozen in disbelief as they stared at Marcus, who looked remarkably healthy, his muscles firm and his face glowing with vitality. They stammered in confusion, remembering that he and his companions had been exiled from the tribe just like them. They crowded around him with envy, asking how he could look so well-fed and if he had found a powerful new tribe to take him in. To them, finding a good tribe was the only possible explanation for such a miraculous transformation. Marcus boasted with immense pride, telling them that he hadn't just found a good tribe, but the best tribe in the world. He announced that his chief was willing to take them all in, causing the men's eyes to light up with a desperate, hopeful glow. He reassured them that the chief already knew of their plight and that they should prepare to be happy. Leo had sent Marcus early that morning specifically to recruit these former tribesmen, knowing they were the perfect candidates to expand his growing community. While Marcus handled the recruitment, Leo had put Jacob and Caleb to work building proper houses and expanding their living space. In Leo's mind, after a day of eating their fill, it was only fair that they put in a hard day's work to build their future. The tribe is located on the riverbank, not far from our old home, Marcus said with a mysterious glint in his eye. To be honest, calling it not far was an understatement. It was practically right next door. As the men looked on in confusion, he announced that their leader was the noble and all-powerful Chief Leo. The moment the name left his lips, the hope in the men's hearts seemed to vanish instantly. Leo, they stammered. Wasn't he the one who lost his mind after failing to cope with the exile? They remembered how he had supposedly threatened Chief Diana and babbled about starting his own tribe. The idea of a man founding a tribe was, in their eyes, an absolute absurdity. Disappointed, the men prepared to head back out to forage, but Marcus simply smirked. He told them that if they wanted the food Chief Leo had sent him with, they would have to join the new tribe first. The men remained skeptical, pointing out that Leo only had 3 followers, hardly enough to build anything. They assumed he had sent Marcus with nothing more than a few sour berries, until they caught sight of what Marcus was actually holding. Their eyes widened in shock. It was fish. We see Silas staring at the 2 large creatures, each as long as a man's forearm and thick as a bowl. He remembered seeing a tiny fish fry on the shore years ago, which had been the most delicious thing he'd ever tasted. And here was Marcus, casually holding 2 massive ones. The men scoffed, telling themselves it was impossible, as even the great chief rarely tasted fish. They wondered how a madman like Leo could provide such a prize. Yet, as they followed Marcus's gesture, they saw the gills of the fish still twitching on the vine. The sight was undeniable. These were indeed fish, and they were incredibly large. For men who hadn't eaten a real meal in days, the sight was hypnotic, and they found themselves salivating uncontrollably. It really was fish, a miracle in the flesh. The cave was filled with the sound of sharp intakes of breath as the realization sank in. Food. It's real food, several men cried out, their eyes gleaming with a desperate hunger as they lunged toward the fish like a pack of starving wolves. They hadn't had a proper meal in what felt like an eternity, and fish was a legendary delicacy they usually only watched from afar. Even the tribal chiefs rarely enjoyed such a luxury. However, Marcus used his newfound strength to easily swing the fish out of their reach. He held them back, reminding them that they hadn't yet sworn their loyalty to Chief Leo. He pointed out the irony. Just a moment ago, they were calling Leo a madman, and now they were begging for his food. Marcus, well-fed and glowing with health, looked like a different man entirely. His muscles, once withered from hunger, were now firm and strong, making it easy to push back the malnourished exiles. Frustrated, the men began to scold him, asking how he could deny his own brother's food. Marcus simply laughed at their indignation. He told them plainly that he was no longer a man of their old tribe, but a proud member of Chief Leo's people. The men frowned at the mention of Leo's name again, still unable to believe that a daydreamer could actually provide for anyone. They told Marcus to stop his nonsense. They urged him to put the fish down and share it, promising they would ask Chief Diana to forgive him and let him return to the cave. They argued that staying with the old tribe meant protection and the chance to gather berries together, a good life, in their opinion. To Marcus, their idea of a good life was nothing short of a joke. He asked them why he would ever want to return to being treated like an animal when he could live with Leo. He had no intention of coming back to this damp hole to wait for death. He looked at his former companions with a flicker of pity as they scrambled for the fish. Just yesterday, he might have found their offer tempting, but everything had changed. He had finally seen what a real life looked like under Leo's leadership. He had experienced the joy of eating his fill and the wonder of the divine fire Leo controlled. Leo didn't just provide food. He used heat to create roasted fish that tasted better than anything they could imagine. All of Marcus's confidence came from one source, his chief. Leo had shown him that men could have dignity and didn't need to beg for scraps from the women. Marcus laughed at their threats, telling them he wasn't easily scared anymore. He boasted that he ate fish every day now. In fact, he was almost tired of it. He explained that the only reason he was stopping them was because the fish belonged to Chief Leo. With a casual shove, he pushed the persistent men away. The exiles, weakened by days of starvation, stood no chance against Marcus's well-nourished strength. They tumbled to the ground, dazed and angry, asking Marcus what he thought he was doing. Silas finally stepped in, telling the men to settle down and check themselves for injuries. He knew all too well that in their current state, a simple wound could be a death sentence. In this harsh environment, without any food to help the body recover, an injury was often the beginning of the end. Silas looked at Marcus, his mind racing as he weighed the impossible sight of the fish against the desperate reality of their survival. Silas stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly as he asked Marcus if what he had just heard was actually true. He asked if Marcus was truly tired of eating fish, to which Marcus nodded, explaining that anyone who joined Chief Leo's tribe could eat their fill under his command. He claimed Leo could summon and control divine fire to roast the fish, making it taste infinitely better than raw meat, a statement that caused a heavy silence to fall over the cave. The men accused him of making up nonsense, warning him that speaking of controlling divine fire was a sacrilege that would surely invite heaven's wrath upon them all. They believed the divine fire was a holy force that turned everything to ash, yet Marcus simply shrugged, indifferent to their superstitious fears. Silas warned that such blasphemy might get them all burned alive, but Marcus remained calm, insisting that while he didn't know about divine laws, he knew Leo controlled the flames. He invited them to see it with their own eyes if they didn't believe him, his expression so serious that the men began to feel a flicker of uneasy curiosity. Silas scoffed, thinking Marcus was just being stubborn, but he decided they might as well follow him to see this supposed miracle for themselves. We see Marcus leading the group to the riverbank, where they spotted two other men fishing while a campfire crackled nearby, just as Marcus had promised. Leo looked up from the fire as the ragged group approached, a small smile playing on his lips as he realized the foundation of his tribe had finally arrived. At first, the exiles were unimpressed by the simple shelters, viewing the flimsy structures as a sign of weakness that a strong wind could easily destroy. But as they drew closer, they saw Leo kneeling by a pile of stones, and suddenly, a bright flame erupted, sending heat and smoke billowing into the sky. The men panicked instantly, screaming that the divine fire had descended and begging for their lives as they scrambled away in total terror. Silas stood frozen, haunted by memories of a great forest fire from decades ago that had blotted out the sun for days and left nothing but ash in its wake. That ancient fear gripped his heart, making his legs shake so violently he couldn't run, even as he shouted for the others to flee the all-consuming flames. He wondered in despair if Leo intended to kill them all, but then he noticed something strange. The fire remained contained within the circle of stones. Marcus urged Leo to put the fire away before the men died of fright, while Leo watched them with an amused glint, knowing he needed to establish his authority. He knew that if he didn't show these people his power over the elements, they would never see him as anything more than a madman. The men whispered in disbelief, unable to comprehend the idea of a human extinguishing a divine force that they believed only the gods could control. Marcus stood with his arms crossed, confidently declaring that Chief Leo could start or stop the fire at will, leaving the men's entire worldview in absolute tatters. The eternal, divine fire had become a mere toy in Marcus's hands, and as he basked in their stunned gazes, he smiled, knowing these men would become the bedrock of his new tribe. Using a simple branch, he spread the embers and covered the flames with stones. One moment the fire roared, and the next, it vanished into a thin wisp of white smoke. The exiles erupted in a deafening outcry, unable to believe that Leo had extinguished a force that could burn heaven and earth as easily as if he were a god, or perhaps a monster. Silas stood frozen, watching the once lethal flames become powerless before this man, while Marcus simply smirked at the primitives, wondering why they were so shocked by a little fire control. He told them this was nothing compared to Leo's true talents, joking that if they were this scared now, they might actually drop dead once they saw him catch and roast fish. As the three brothers mocked the terrified crowd, the exiles grew resentful, until a sudden shout from the riverbank drew everyone's attention to a vine twitching in the water. We see that the brothers had been holding a vine connected to a submerged net. Leo had instructed them to pull with all their might the moment they felt a tug. The two men began to haul the line in with grunts of effort, leaving the onlookers confused as to why anyone would bother pulling vines out of a river. Perhaps it was just exercise. Marcus casually mentioned they were harvesting fish, a claim so bold it left the exiles' jaws dropping in collective disbelief. To be honest, they thought he was just bragging again. They scoffed, sarcastically suggesting that if Leo could control fire and catch fish out of thin air, he might as well be able to fly or slay dragons while he was at it. Some even rolled their eyes in annoyance, but just then, the two brothers gave one final heave and dragged the heavy net onto the muddy bank. With a triumphant grin, Leo told them to open the net and show the skeptics exactly what they had pulled from the depths of the river. At first, the crowd only saw a tangled mess of woven grass, mocking the pathetic mat and laughing at the idea that such a poorly made tool could ever catch a meal. They joked that they had better mats back in their caves, suggesting that if throwing grass into a river worked, they would have been kings long ago. Ignoring the mockery, Leo stepped forward and flipped the net over, revealing a pile of fresh, thrashing fish that shimmered like silver coins in the afternoon sun. The sight of 11 fish flopping on the sand left the men questioning their own sanity, wondering if the world had gone mad or if Leo was truly a worker of miracles. Their entire worldview was being trampled before their eyes. Yet Marcus just sighed, acting like a weary elder who was disappointed by his tribesmen's lack of composure. The crowd murmured about this new term, roasted fish, a concept they couldn't even begin to grasp since they had never seen food prepared with fire before. They shook their heads, still doubtful despite the evidence before them, finding the idea of combining the divine fire with their food to be utterly absurd. Leo didn't argue. He simply called the brothers over to begin cleaning the catch, and they rushed to help with eyes gleaming, eager for the feast to come. The brothers worked with surprising speed, their mouths watering as they remembered the incredible flavor of last night's meal. The onlookers, however, were baffled as to why they were cutting the fish open and throwing parts away instead of just eating it raw. The exiles watched Silas and the others discard the innards, whispering that wasting food was a shameful sin that would surely enrage their great ancestress. To be honest, they couldn't understand why anyone would throw away perfectly good, if slightly slimy, parts of a catch. Having spent days starving in their damp caves, the sight of such waste made them jump with frustration, though they remained powerless to stop it. Silas simply scoffed, telling them they had no idea what they were talking about, and that Leo had specifically ordered the removal of the guts. He explained with a proud smirk that leaving the innards inside would ruin the flavor of the roast, looking down on the ignorant primitives who had yet to see the world. He warned them that once the fish was ready, there certainly wouldn't be enough to go around if they kept complaining. The tribesmen were incensed, arguing that meat was meat and that the ancestress would never forgive such arrogance. They were caught in a storm of conflicting emotions, furious at the perceived waste, yet deeply bitter that the fish didn't belong to them in the first place. Leo watched their tantrum with a quiet, amused smile, thinking that once they tasted the roast, they might just start worshipping him instead of their ancestors. Just then, Silas announced that the preparation was complete. 4 large fish and 7 smaller ones were ready for the fire. The catch was laid out, shimmering and cleaned, awaiting the next step in Leo's mysterious process. As the divine fire was stoked once more, several tribesmen felt their knees go weak, and a few even collapsed in terror. Silas watched the flames with trembling breath, wondering if the man he followed was still the same Leo he had known, or something far more formidable. Following Leo's instructions, the 3 brothers began driving sharpened branches into the soft earth around the campfire. It was a strange sight. 3 men carefully positioning sticks as if they were performing a sacred ritual rather than preparing a simple dinner. Each branch held a portion of the catch, suspended just close enough for the flames to begin their work. As the skin turned a beautiful golden brown and oil began to sizzle, the crowd gasped, horrified that Leo was using the holy fire for something as mundane as cooking. To the exiles, it felt as though the sky were falling. They screamed for everyone to run before a divine curse struck them all for this ultimate act of disrespect. One man tried to flee in a panic, only to trip over his own feet in his haste to escape the impending doom. They lay there, paralyzed by a mix of exhaustion and dread, certain that heaven would punish them simply for witnessing such a scene. Silas swallowed hard, whispering in a terrified voice that Leo had surely lost his mind and had taken the rest of them with him. The crowd descended into a state of nervous hysteria, laughing manically at the absurdity of it all. They told themselves that everyone associated with Leo was a lunatic, convinced that the entire world had finally tipped into madness. Leo, of course, couldn't have cared less about their existential crisis. His focus was entirely on the sizzling fish and the intensity of the heat. He knew that even a slight mistake in timing would ruin the texture, and in his world, a perfect meal was a very serious matter indeed. The 3 brothers watched him with pure adoration, convinced that only their leader possessed the godlike power to control flavor itself. When the moment was exactly right, Leo gave a sharp command for them to pull the branches away from the heat. They jumped to obey, lifting the roasted prizes far from the embers as a new, intoxicating aroma began to drift through the air. The tribesmen, still reeling from their fear, suddenly paused as the scent hit them, a smell unlike anything they had ever experienced. They blinked in confusion, tracing the delicious scent back to the very spot where the sacrilege had occurred. It was a sight they would never forget. The fish they had mocked was now transformed into something that looked and smelled utterly divine. Their primal instincts, honed by days of hunger, began a violent battle against their superstitious fear of the fire. The aroma was a powerful lure, tugging at their very souls and making their previous resolve crumble like dry earth. The brothers stood there, basking in the scent of the charred, savory fish, waiting eagerly for the signal to eat. They knew that watching them feast would likely drive the starving exiles to the brink of insanity, and they found the prospect quite entertaining. Leo smiled at the conflicted faces in the distance and told his men to eat slowly, making sure to savor every bite. He wanted the onlookers to see exactly what life was like in his tribe, a place where the divine was simply a tool for a better life. Delicious, the three brothers exclaimed, their eyes shining as they tore into the roasted fish. They had spent the entire morning working for this single moment, and as the savory oils melted on their tongues, they savored every bite with a slow, deliberate joy. It seemed that once you tasted the roast, it was impossible to feel anything but pure bliss. Leo took a bite himself and nodded in approval. At the very least, he no longer had to worry about parasites or the grim reality of eating raw, slimy fish. As the onlookers watched the trio's ecstatic expressions and heard the satisfying crunch of the charred skin, the air filled with the sound of growling stomachs. A single, desperate thought echoed through the crowd. They wanted that food more than anything in the world. They were torn. This was a sacrilegious object created by the holy fire, yet the aroma was so intoxicating it was driving them to the brink of madness. It was a revelation for them. Apparently, defying the gods resulted in something incredibly delicious. Oh, what a pity, Silas sighed with mock sadness, glancing at the starving crowd. He reminded them that Leo had kindly invited them to join the tribe and share the feast, only to be called a lunatic for his generosity. The tribesmen felt as though their world were ending. They cursed their own hesitation and wondered why they hadn't believed Silas when he first arrived with the fish. Now, with the feast right in front of them, the regret was almost too much to bear. Deep down, they realized that even being a servant in Leo's tribe would be better than being treated like a common animal in their old village. As the last of the fish remained, Leo decided it was time to give them one final choice. I'll ask one last time, Leo said calmly, swallowing a mouthful of fish as the atmosphere grew heavy with tension. Who wants to join our tribe? He waited, knowing these people would become the very foundation of his new civilization. The exiles were caught in a desperate internal struggle. In their old tribe, they were treated as mere livestock, yet Leo's group looked like a gathering of complete madmen, though, to be honest, they were very well-fed madmen. Suddenly, the tension snapped as the crowd abandoned their hesitation and charged forward in a frantic scramble. They cried out for Leo to take them in, begging for forgiveness and declaring him their new leader with absolute desperation. Nearly 10 tribesmen threw themselves at Leo's feet, their previous doubts replaced by a primal need for survival. In his mind, Leo heard the familiar chime of the system, confirming that his tribe was growing and his contribution points were stacking up. One by one, the notifications rang out as each new member joined the fold, bringing his total contribution points to a respectable 135. It was a satisfying sound, marking the true beginning of his rise to power. Chief, is there any fish left? One of the newcomers asked timidly, his eyes wide with longing. Leo laughed heartily at the sight and signaled for Silas and the others to distribute the remaining catch among their new brothers. He wanted them to see immediately that they had made the right decision. The tribesmen stared at the roasted fish in their hands, this sacrilegious gift from the fire, with a mixture of awe and overwhelming hunger. They ate until their faces were covered in oil, slumped over in a state of pure, greasy euphoria. Nearby, however, an elder named Jacob held his portion with a conflicted expression, troubled by the price of their survival. Jacob acknowledged that Leo had incredible skill, but he remained convinced the young man was insane for disrespecting the gods. He ate only because he had to, telling himself that a single meal wouldn't cloud his judgment or his loyalty to the old ways. He dreamed of the day his own spiritual cultivation would reach the next level, allowing him to lead his people away from this blasphemous tribe. With a heavy sigh, Jacob finished his meal and settled into a meditative pose to begin his training. At that moment, the system chimed again, announcing that the tribe had reached 10 members. This milestone unlocked the true cultivation system, a path that, in this world, had been preserved only for women. While women could progress with ease, men who attempted these methods often faced disaster, ranging from madness to total physical collapse. Nevertheless, the ancient techniques were instantly etched into Leo's mind, ready for him to use. Leo had already noticed Jacob, the elder with the highest prestige and natural talent among the men. He knew that in this world, men were limited by female-centric cultivation laws. But Leo, of course, was the exception to every rule. Jacob had struggled for years, his progress stalled, and his life nearly lost to several cultivation accidents. He was only alive by sheer luck. But now, the true path of male cultivation was etched into Leo's mind, and he knew that winning Jacob's loyalty was the key to securing the rest of the new tribesmen. According to the system, there were 9 levels of cultivation, each marked by a massive increase in physical strength. While an ordinary man possessed standard strength, a first-level cultivator like Jacob could double his power, though the women of the world were often far stronger. Most women reached the 2nd level, doubling their strength again, while someone like Luna had already attained the 4th level. This power scaled up to the 9th level, beyond which lay realms that even the system's vast knowledge had never fully revealed to the world. We see that talent is determined by one's innate vitality, and Leo was surprised to find that his own was the most abundant of all. Luna followed closely behind, then the other gifted women, and finally Jacob and the younger men who showed some promise. Leo began his first attempt at the orthodox cultivation method, feeling his blood surge and his body grow warm with energy. In just a few moments, he achieved the first level, a rank that had taken Jacob over 10 years of incorrect practice to reach. You're still stuck at the first level, aren't you? Leo asked calmly, approaching Jacob in his quiet corner. He told the elder that he knew everything, the failed attempts, the near-death experiences, and the fact that his progress had been frozen for a very long time. He looked at the elder and told him plainly that everything he was doing was a complete waste of effort. Jacob was stunned. Most men in the tribe had no talent for cultivation, and only those like him were ever taught the old ways by their elders. He never expected Leo to see right through him, asking with a mix of shock and suspicion how the young man could possibly know he was stuck. Leo warned him to stop, explaining that the techniques passed down by the village elders were actually designed for women. Unless he intended to undergo a radical physical change, practicing those female-centric laws would only lead to failure or a violent internal collapse. Do you actually have a better way? Jacob asked tentatively, though his voice was still laced with doubt. Jacob admitted that while the fish and the fire were impressive, he still felt Leo was just a showman chasing an impossible dream. To him, the idea of a male-led tribe was a fantasy, as women had ruled the human world since long before he was even born. He looked Leo in the eye, questioning how a mere youth could think a few tricks could overturn the natural order of the world. Leo simply replied that if Jacob continued his current path, his body would eventually be swallowed by the strain, like a leaf lost in a storm. Sit down and practice, Leo commanded, and I will show you exactly what you need to do. He sat cross-legged opposite Jacob and began to demonstrate the system's method, leaving the elder in a state of utter disbelief. Jacob's face twisted with a mix of shock and mockery, as he had never even seen Leo practice before today. He chuckled, calling Leo a foolish child and assuming the boy had simply picked up some dangerous, unorthodox nonsense from an unknown source. To Jacob, it seemed far more likely that Leo was reciting some strange, forbidden theory rather than actual wisdom. He found the idea of a teenager guiding his cultivation to be nothing short of a joke. Jacob shook his head and closed his eyes, beginning his breathing exercises to circulate his energy, a process that usually required absolute silence. In their culture, disturbing someone during cultivation was a grave offense, often met with a lethal response. Leo sighed at the elder's stubbornness, pitying the man for wasting his life on techniques that were literally killing him. Jacob ignored him, sinking into a deep meditative trance, but his senses remained sharp enough to feel the world around him. Without another word, Leo reached out and pressed a specific pressure point on Jacob's body, exactly as the system had instructed. The flow of energy was instantly blocked, and Jacob's skin turned a bright, angry red as his internal balance was shattered. The elder was furious. Interference during cultivation was incredibly dangerous and strictly forbidden by tribal law. His fists clenched as he struggled with his surging blood, wanting nothing more than to strike Leo down for such a reckless provocation. Jacob, I'll say it again, your method is wrong, Leo stated firmly, ignoring the elder's rage. He explained that he was only helping because the other tribesmen respected Jacob, and he made it clear that this would be his one and only lesson. Leo warned him that this was a one-time offer. If he didn't memorize it now, no amount of begging would earn a second lesson. Ignoring Jacob's internal panic, Leo began to forcefully reroute the elder's energy flow, shifting it from the female-centric path to the true masculine method. As the energy shifted, Jacob's initial rage dissolved into a profound sense of wonder at the strange, rhythmic flow within him. He felt as though his body was no longer his own, no longer obeying his will, but following the precise commands of Leo's guiding fingers. The energy surged faster and faster, and though Jacob was startled, he found he couldn't resist Leo's intent. He could only focus on keeping his vitals stable. Leo continued to strike specific pressure points with practiced ease, noting that while Jacob's talent was the best among the men, it still lagged behind the women. Even with the correct method, Leo estimated the elder might only ever reach the second level of cultivation. As he pressed the final acupoint, Jacob's energy finally locked into the correct masculine circuit, a path that, if memorized, would end his years of struggling on the brink of death. Whether the elder could actually retain this knowledge was now entirely up to him. Leo exhaled a long breath and opened his eyes, only to find Jacob staring at him with a completely transformed expression, trembling as he asked why his own blood no longer obeyed his command. Jacob felt a lingering fear as he realized that if that energy flow had been severed, he would be a dead man. In other words, Leo had just held his life in his hands. Leo simply explained that since the old method was broken, he had used his technique to fix it, asking if the elder felt the difference. Leo spoke with a calm indifference that only deepened Jacob's shock. The elder couldn't believe a mere touch could fundamentally alter one's internal cultivation. He began to frantically probe his own energy, feeling the remnants of the medicinal fish still circulating through his system. In an instant, he was stunned to find his energy moving several times faster than ever before. Realizing the opportunity, he desperately tried to memorize the new path of the energy flow, but the sensation began to fade as the medicinal energy was fully absorbed. It had actually worked. His cultivation speed had increased exponentially, a feat he previously thought impossible. Jacob realized that this young man had seen through his entire internal structure at a single glance and corrected a decade of errors in a heartbeat. The realization left Jacob in a state of pure, unadulterated shock, followed quickly by a wave of cold dread. He looked up at Leo, his pupils trembling and sweat pouring down his face, suddenly aware that his years of seniority among the men meant absolutely nothing now. He couldn't fathom how his decades of practice were so easily eclipsed by a youth, but Leo reminded him that in this tribe, there are no impossibilities. Leo told him plainly that if he wanted to stay, he must truly submit and recognize him as the leader who would change everything. Leo spoke of a future where they would build a powerful society, one where the men who had been looked down upon would finally stand tall. He stood up, casually dusting the dirt from his clothes, and looked down at the elder with the quiet confidence of a man who holds all the cards. When asked how he achieved such things, Leo simply credited his system, though Jacob assumed the boy had gone mad from the trauma of being exiled. The elder was terrified by the idea of a tribe where men held more power than women, a concept that defied the only world he knew. Leo reminded him that in a world of survival, the strong always dictate the terms, regardless of gender. Because he possessed the knowledge to make these men more capable than the women of this era, the tribe they were building would be a true patriarchal clan. With a triumphant smile, Leo told Jacob that submission wasn't just a temporary survival tactic, but the only logical choice for his future. He acknowledged that the elder still held on to his pride, but he wasn't worried. Time and results would eventually take care of that. Leo promised that once Jacob truly committed, he would help him reach an even higher level of power. He made a show of turning to leave, but before he could take a step, he heard a heavy thud on the ground behind him. He turned back to see Jacob prostrate on the ground, calling out to him as leader with a voice full of genuine desperation. Jacob admitted his previous narrow-mindedness, declaring that Leo's guidance had opened his eyes to a world he never knew existed. The elder pledged his absolute loyalty, promising to follow Leo's every command from that day forward. Deep down, he was filled with regret for not memorizing the energy path sooner, realizing he had missed a chance for even greater power, but life rarely offers second chances. Seeing the sincerity in the old man's eyes, Leo allowed himself a small smile. Another key member had been successfully recruited. He then instructed Jacob to gather all the men who had any experience with cultivation so the real training could begin. Leo explained that he would teach Jacob the correct masculine methods, and Jacob would then be responsible for training the rest of the tribesmen. Overjoyed, Jacob hurried off to gather the others, eager to show them that their lives were about to change forever. Jacob scrambled up from the ground, his heart racing with a newfound gratitude as he hurried away. He understood perfectly well that the correct cultivation method meant everything. If the young men of the tribe learned this, they would finally be seen as more than just livestock or playthings for the women. A little later, Jacob returned to the campfire with 3 or 4 tribesmen who showed a spark of talent for cultivation. As Jacob sat cross-legged to begin, the younger men watched him closely, while the rest of the tribe gathered nearby, whispering in confusion about what their leader was planning to do. They wondered if Leo truly intended to teach Jacob, since cultivation was usually reserved for those with innate gifts. They had never seen Leo practice himself, and they worried that such a dangerous process, where a single mistake could lead to a violent death, was being treated like a mere game. Jacob ignored their whispers, telling them to watch closely because Leo's guidance would allow their cultivation speed to finally match that of the women. As he spoke those words, the air seemed to freeze, and the younger men looked at him as if he had finally lost his mind. The idea that a man could cultivate as fast as a woman seemed impossible to them. After all, a woman's single day of practice usually outweighed a man's entire week. They admitted that Leo was impressive for catching fish and creating fire, but this was something entirely different. They conceded that he was a master of the hearth and the hunt, and they truly respected his strength. However, in their minds, no amount of cleverness could overcome the fundamental laws of their world. They believed that no matter how skilled Leo was, the gap in spiritual energy was simply too vast to bridge. To them, the natural order was set in stone. The young men threw up their hands in frustration, noting that, unlike Jacob, they didn't have the patience to suffer through years of practice only to be outclassed by any woman. The surrounding crowd nodded in agreement, feeling that striving for such power was a path to certain madness. It was a common belief that women were simply terrifying beings who could surpass a man's month of hard labor with just a few days of casual effort. They muttered to one another about the sheer unfairness of it all, convinced that Leo was attempting the impossible. Jacob couldn't stand the mockery and started to rise, but Leo calmly pressed him back down, telling him that their belief didn't matter. Results would speak for themselves. He instructed Jacob to simply focus on his internal flow while he provided the necessary guidance. Overjoyed, Jacob settled into a meditative state, and we see Leo begin to strike the same acupoints as before, though this time his movements were much slower. He was being deliberate, ensuring that the elder could feel and memorize every single turn of the energy's path. The onlookers were terrified, certain that Jacob was flirting with death by letting Leo tinker with his internal energy. Their anxiety only grew until they noticed something strange. Under Leo's hands, Jacob's energy wasn't failing. It was accelerating at an incredible pace. The energy pathways widened and stabilized, and suddenly, the power Jacob had suppressed for over a decade surged forth, breaking him through to the second realm. Jacob let out a long, booming laugh, staring at his own hands in utter shock at the strength now coursing through him. The clearing fell silent as Leo explained that the second realm wasn't a gift reserved only for women, but a destination their old, broken methods could never reach. He told them plainly that he held the key to the correct path, and that under his guidance, their progress would be steady and sure. It was as simple as that, or so Leo claimed as he finished the session, though he knew the system-granted knowledge in his mind was far beyond their understanding. He realized that while they could feel the flow now, their memories would eventually fade, and the path would need to be reinforced. For now, his priority was raising the tribe's strength to counter the formidable women under Sophie's command. He looked around at the silent crowd, expecting the usual wave of shocked exclamations, but instead, he found a heavy, unsettling stillness hanging over the clearing. Finally, a few strained voices broke the silence, their faces twisted in disbelief at the sight of a man reaching the second realm. It was a feat unheard of in their history, a direct challenge to the only reality they had ever known. They looked at Leo with a mixture of awe and genuine fear, wondering what kind of god or monster could master the elements and rewrite the laws of cultivation so easily. To them, he was becoming something far more than just a leader. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on, and many of the tribesmen kept their heads bowed, unable to meet the gaze of the man they now saw as a divine anomaly. Leo noticed their dizziness and fear, but he knew this was a necessary step in breaking their old chains. He told them calmly that only those who could accept this new reality would have a place in the powerful society he intended to build. He understood that to these primitive people, his correct actions looked like heresy, but he was determined to drag them into a new era, one way or another. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Jacob truly reached the second realm. After 10 years of bitter cultivation and countless brushes with death, he had finally broken through, a feat they believed was reserved only for women. They had never imagined Leo could actually make this happen, yet here was the proof. Incredulous shouts began to ripple through the air, with many whispering that their new leader, Leo, was truly an all-powerful being. It wasn't just that he could catch fish and master the fire. He had even dared to rewrite the sacred laws of cultivation itself. He had fundamentally changed the path of their internal energy. Some of the men began to pray to the ancestral mother, begging her not to punish Leo for his heresy. They argued that he was a good man who fed them delicious fish, and surely, if he only changed the path for Jacob, she could find it in her heart to forgive him. While the younger men were busy praying for mercy, Leo remained focused on the task at hand. He called forward everyone who had ever attempted to cultivate, explaining that Jacob had already memorized the correct flow of energy. Now, it was time for Jacob to guide each and every one of them toward that same correct path. The suggestion that they could all learn this new method sent a shockwave through the group. They wondered if it was truly possible for them to follow in Jacob's footsteps, or if Leo's secret technique was something they could all actually use. Jacob stood tall, confirming that this was indeed the method Leo had gifted them. He promised that with this technique, their cultivation speed would not only match the women of the tribe, but likely surpass it. He told them that with enough hard work, they would eventually grow stronger than the women who had always treated them like mere livestock. As Jacob stood up, his eyes were bright with a fire that hadn't been there before. Inspired by his words, the men began to clamor for a chance to learn, desperate to shed the insulting label of male monkeys. They were tired of being looked at like garbage and were ready to fight to reclaim their lost dignity. The clearing erupted in a roar of excitement that seemed to reach the very heavens. Leo watched them, his own resolve hardening. He knew he had to raise their strength quickly if he was to ever settle the score with Sophie's tribe. Meanwhile, back at the riverbank, we find ourselves inside the caves of Sophie's tribe. Sophie herself sat on a stone throne, her expression cold and her ankle adorned with a bone bead chain, surrounded by her female warriors. One of her scouts reported that the men in the southwest caves had all vanished, likely having died off. Sophie simply scoffed, remarking that it was a good riddance since they couldn't even gather food properly anyway. She assumed those male monkeys had simply wandered off to die in the heat because they were too stupid to stay put. However, she wasn't about to let any potential resources slip away, so she ordered a stronger group of men to go out and find them. She decided to send the third squad, suspecting that the runaways might have found a hidden berry grove or a patch of wild vegetables. If they had, she fully intended to snatch it away from those skinny monkeys without a second thought. Sophie shifted her weight with an air of arrogant grace, her bone jewelry clicking as she moved. Nearby, a man named Marcus overheard the order to send the third squad, and a flash of genuine anxiety crossed his face. The next morning, we returned to Leo as he woke up in their makeshift camp. Since there were no natural caves in this area, they had been forced to build temporary shelters, which were becoming more numerous as the tribe grew. They had plenty of fish and a growing workforce, but Leo realized he lacked the knowledge to build truly sturdy, permanent housing. The men he had rescued so far were mostly from the 4th Squad, and construction wasn't exactly their specialty. Before they had split from Sophie's tribe, there had been 4 squads of men, and it was the 3rd squad that held the highest status because of their building skills. To be honest, even the elite builders were still treated like monkeys, but their expertise was exactly what Leo needed now. Even among those treated like monkeys, there was a hierarchy, with the 4th squad at the very bottom. Suddenly, the system detected a keyword, unlocking a shelter builder in the contribution shop. As long as he collected the necessary materials, this tool could construct a secure, private, and sturdy shelter for just 100 points. Leo didn't hesitate for a second before making the purchase. The system confirmed the transaction, promising that the construction process would be fully automated. Just then, a frantic voice called out for Leo, breaking his concentration. It was Marcus, gasping for air as he delivered a warning. The 3rd squad was on their way to seize everything. He begged Leo to take the fish and run before it was too late, but Leo simply looked at him with a strange, knowing expression. He asked Marcus to clarify exactly which squad was coming. When Marcus confirmed it was the 3rd squad, Leo let out a dark little chuckle. These were the very men skilled in construction, and to be honest, their timing couldn't have been more perfect. With their help, the speed of gathering materials would reach a whole new level. Leo told a worried Marcus not to fear, as these men wouldn't be able to lay a finger on him. Marcus thought he was joking, pointing out that the 3rd squad was better fed and backed by Sophie's personal protection. He was certain they would just steal the fish and hand them over to their leader. He grew tearful, convinced Leo was overconfident just because he could catch fish, while Sophie was a 4th realm master with an entire tribe behind her. Leo simply patted his head and told him to relax. He assured Marcus that even if the fish were taken, he had plenty of ways to survive. Deep down, Leo knew that a sturdy shelter was the foundation of power in this world, and he finally had the means to build one. Once the shelter was up, the 3rd squad wouldn't be able to touch a single fish scale. Marcus, however, remained miserable, certain he would be punished by Sophie for coming to warn Leo in the first place. Leo laughed, suggesting Marcus just tell her he was kidnapped. As they headed back, Marcus followed closely, still skeptical but ready to help gather the wood, sand, and stone Leo required.